So I'm going to ask the panelists up here to introduce themselves. I'll introduce myself first. I am Julie Janiski, a principal at Buro Happold. We are a global engineering firm. We have an office here in Boston of 50 people, to over 2,000 people globally, over 30 offices now, I think. And I was really, really lucky to work on the House at Cornell Tech project while I was in New York before I moved up here. That was my introduction to Passive House. And since then, have been working on a ton of embodied carbon projects locally here, internationally, regionally, et cetera. And really excited for Ken's invitation to come here and have a conversation about how those worlds collide and ultimately what we can do on the topic of embodied carbon. So with that, I'm going to pass. Are you guys going to share a mic?
We're going to share.
All right, thank you. I'm going to pass over to Patrick here to introduce himself, and we'll go down the line.
Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Haydon, founder and owner of Haycon, a small building development company here in Boston. Very much focused on passive house projects. Currently, we're doing 3, one of which is a mass timber, which most folks are excited about. So that's going to be.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Taranto. I'm the Vice President of Sustainability for the STO Building Group. The STO Building Group is a general contractor construction management firm. We recently, in the new ENR rankings, we're number 4 in the country, so rather large, about $10 billion worth of revenue a year. We operate across 4 countries, 48 offices, under 13 brands. And in the Northeast, we operate as Structure Tone, as Pavarini McGovern, and as LF Driscoll.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matt O'Malia, and I'm an architect with OPAL Architecture. I'm also a co-founder of Timber HP. Timber HP is a startup in Maine, and we're going to be manufacturing insulation from wood residuals or wood fiber insulation. It's a startup that has taken a lot of effort to get off the ground, as wood fiber insulation is currently only produced in Europe and will be the first domestic production facility, starting production about this time next year.
And I am Travis Anderson, Senior Infrastructure and Energy Planner at the Boston Planning and Development Agency and the Department of Climate Change and Environmental Planning. I have a very long title. I also have about 10 years of experience in the passive house world, having worn the hat as developer, builder, trained as an architect, and in the field, and now back at City Hall working on policy.
Is it true that the longer your title is, the smaller your staff is?
I have one co-op intern.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So what we thought we would do is to tackle a handful of categories during the panel discussion. We're going to start with a little bit of myth busting, misperceptions, some common questions that come up around the topic of embodied carbon when it comes to passive house. A little bit of the question of what leverage do we have, shared values not being enough, shared leverage being better. Missteps and lessons learned. Let's share and share alike, right? Failure is usually as a leader to success, and then shifting the narrative to maximize opportunity. So there's a I talked to Ken about this while we were prepping for the panel to say I don't think we're going to talk about passive house the whole time. Is that okay? And he said yes. So we're going to talk about it a little bit at the beginning because it's relevant, and embodied carbon and passive house absolutely go together, but we want to spend the majority of the time talking about embodied carbon, how it is implemented, what we're doing about it, what we know and don't know about it, and just really dig into that topic specifically. So where I'd like to kick it off with my compatriots here is a common question that I've actually heard when I talk about embodied carbon with passive house is it true that passive house insulation requirements are more of an embodied carbon burden than they are worth? Right? Why are we talking about passive house? Don't we care about embodied carbon anymore? Why are we doing more insulation? That's just more embodied carbon. So interested in your thoughts.
So my background is I'm a passive house architect, and we started early days in 2008. We certified the first passive house in Maine, the 12th in the United States, and there was a lot of cowboying around the technology around passive house, and a lot of people making it up, importing a lot of products from Europe and so forth. But what I think attracted myself, and I think probably the audience, is it's a data-driven approach. You're relying on data for predictive modeling. We understand as a group collectively that modeling is quite accurate. The more buildings we built, and a variety of different projects all over the place, we realized as a design build company as well, as we had two problems. And this is what's kind of fun about this panel discussion with Julia, is because we were working on a project, multifamily, here in Boston with the goal of passive house. And the conversation we had after one of the meetings shifted over between she and I about embodied carbon. And at that point, she said, you should look at Tally, which is, many are aware, probably an embodied carbon calculator or LCA tool, which was my first exposure to that. Because as a passive house architect, I was looking at the operational carbon, feeling very self-satisfied with myself being a hero. Thanks, Julia. I didn't feel like a hero after I ran the calc. So the question was, what is passive house other than a similar structural system, most likely? A totally different envelope, obviously, but the way we see it coming from Maine is you're basically using 3 times the amount of insulation in one more piece of glass. And then what we realized early on was the insulation options that are cost competitive and scalable and viable, for cost competitive construction on a first cost basis, not long-term obviously, were all non-renewable, non-recyclable, made from high embodied carbon energy sources, if not directly from fossil fuel, the exact material we're trying to save. So were we doing the right thing? No, actually, we were delaying the solution by a 10-year payback and operational carbon savings to pay the footprint for the materials we're using to make a high-performance building. That's when we had a little bit of crisis, a sort of personal crisis about what we were actually trying to do. Also, as a design build company, we got a lot of feedback about the handleability of insulation products. Its reputation precedes it. I don't need to tell anyone about itchy, scratchy, pink, blue, and other funny colored materials and how they are to install. So that set us on a kind of a journey to understand what is an alternative with this new ability to analyze embodied carbon the same way we were doing with passive house using PHPP. We can do the exact same thing with carbon and the materials we're using. We realize insulation products in the US are extremely limited, that are scalable and cost competitive, and that's when we came across wood fiber insulation. And to answer the question, to myth bust, for us in the United States, cellulose is a great insulation to address this, but it's not scalable. There's declining paper production. It's 10% of the market. In some cases, it's difficult to source the material. So the question is, what do we have as alternatives? And that's where Timber HP came from, was asking the simple questions. If there is a recyclable carbon sequestering insulation material, which totally offsets that penalty on carbon from the construction basis, why isn't that available at scale in the United States? Silly little naive question. Took a lot of effort to answer it. But I think that's the thing for us, is we came from a data-driven approach and we realized we had a problem and we know that there's a solution. It just took a heck of a lot of energy and effort to kind of realize it in the United States.
I did not realize that I was giving Matt the perfect opportunity for him to pitch his new company. P.S.
Which is great. And
But I'm
kudos.
glad he did. Does anybody want to follow up on that?
Well, when we started at Place Taylor, the company that I worked for previous to moving over to the city, we were heavily focused on kind of more double wall construction, cellulose insulation. And what we actually did was kind of develop our own internal in-house carbon calculator. And that calculator took into account where we were sourcing materials from the local lumber yards, and then where they were getting their supply chains from, and kind of looking at that regionally. We also started considering the impacts of our labor force too, and we actually did an analysis of vehicle miles traveled. And what we found was, if you go back and forth to the site with lots of deliveries, have different subs come in periodically throughout the duration of the project, we saw that the VMTs were actually another part of what we needed to consider too. So I think we took that as like a way of looking at embodied carbon kind of more holistically, not just from a material standpoint, but from when the carbon implications were throughout the entire project. And from that, I guess the myth that was in that was, we needed to have, we were trying to figure out ways to have more inclusive sort of design build, sort of vertical infrastructure to have the project, move forward and get put through. So actually, I'm kind of totally lost my train of thought. Sorry, guys. So the VMTs, what they were proving out to us was um, we saw that not a lot of other companies were taking this into consideration, and that it actually made us sort of look to material sourcing in a very different way, and project sourcing in a very different way, and how we worked with subs and how we integrated the whole project throughout, just from this little sort of like finding we had right within the data. Similar to Matt, we were very proud of ourselves in that we were doing these sort of really, low intensity, really well done, high performance housing, and kind of pushing those mandates. But the realization for us was that we had to start thinking about the whole scope. And that if we weren't doing that, we aren't really solving the carbon problem without considering all the aspects of the site.
Yeah, I think that the thing that comes to mind specific to insulation is it depends, right? Is that you do have to have that holistic viewpoint of what is the operational carbon versus the material carbon. And to your point, that's the other half of the embodied carbon story, right? Is the construction process, and that includes getting all the tradespeople to and from the site. So with VMTs in particular, we've been tracking it on a number of our sites, and what matters is where is the site, right? If we're doing an industrial project off of an highway exit to nowhere, right, which is where these big industrial projects tend to be, the VMTs are actually a huge part of all of the carbon on the project. Like,
Travis, did you already say what VMT is?
I'm sorry, vehicle miles traveled.
Yeah, okay,
sorry.
cool. Just,
So think about, you're building a 3 million square foot warehouse project, right? The hundreds of tradespeople that are coming, there are the hundreds of trucks that are coming in and out with product delivery every day. That is a huge amount of carbon. And then, especially if we've got to winterize a job site, then we start burning propane and all that fun stuff. So then you get more carbon. So that second half of the embodied carbon story, I think, is a part of the story that we have been trying to tell, because that's where we can contribute, right? I can say all day long to a design firm, like, get us in as early as possible in pre-con, because we want to help you talk about the materials. What are you specifying? What mix design goes where, and when do we use it? Optimization charts, all day long. But when the rubber meets the road and we've got to start building, the other half of that embodied carbon story is a big piece of the tale to tell.
Thank you for that. I'm curious. So, Matt, you brought up the idea of the payback, right? Like the upfront carbon investment, embodied carbon investment, in order to have a more robust, more material envelope, which is true in Passive House. Although there's lots of conversations about mechanical systems being smaller and needing to account for that, and how that all trades off is a big TBD question mark, right? Pending more data and EPDs from mechanical system contractors and manufacturers. Any mechanical system manufacturers in the room? I've already hit up Swegon about some EPDs, but anybody else? No? All right, cool. So this question of embodied carbon investment, right? Upfront investment, embodied carbon. We did a back of the envelope calculation for the house at Cornell Tech to understand, what's the number of years basically that we sort of pay ourselves back by operational carbon savings by the nature of having a passive house operating building. It was less than 10. I want to say it was around 5. I'd have to go back and look at it. And it wasn't complete because we couldn't account for the mechanical systems yet. I think we've sort of gotten to a place now where we can. I'm curious if anyone else in the room has done this exercise, or anybody else up here has done this exercise to understand this idea of an embodied carbon investment up front.
We've not. I mean, the projects right now that we're tracking embodied carbon on, they're multi-year projects, and so I've got some coming to a close in the next few months, and so we are hopeful to be able to do that analysis after the fact, but still early days for us.
So yeah, we've been looking at that quite a bit from both the architecture side and also from a product delivery side. What's the right balance? And I think for us, we do want to be accountable in the marketplace for the claims that we would make. And I do think it's difficult because when we're talking about insulation, which when it comes to obviously the carbon payback equation, that's what we're going to focus on. I mean, there's triple glazing as well, of course. And so I think for us, not all insulations have similar carbon footprint. Some have significantly higher. Then we're talking also about global warming potential, which comes to foam and blowing agents, which is obviously a hot topic and being addressed in reduced global warming potential. But I think the answer is it really depends on the insulation types, and they're not all the same for sure. I think the one thing that we're interested in is as we're thinking about changing construction systems, and Patrick has experience, for example, the CLT, where we're looking at alternative biogenic materials, particularly those that store carbon. They do have a process energy to make them and manufacture them. Wood fiber insulation certainly does through the refining and sort of manufacturing process, but that's offset in theory by the stored carbon. What I think is tricky, and where carbon, embodied carbon calculation, LCA calculation, really is a little bit like Passive House was, in my opinion, 8 to 10 years ago, and you probably have a lot of insight into this, Julie, but the EPDs and the accountability and particularly end-of-life recyclability of materials, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, because let's think of it this way: the construction industry really hasn't thought too much about recyclability at end of life. It's build it and landfill it or whatever. We do build buildings with a very short lifespan too in the US. I mean, that's a real reality. So I think part of this whole question is, one, what's your feedstock for the material that you're using? And that's going to have a big impact on your embodied carbon, no doubt about it. But the other part of it is what happens at end of life. And if at end of life you can demonstrate that it can go back into the production of those materials, and you can close that loop, not a landfill, not incineration, not otherwise, I think that's where, when it comes to EPDs and doing the modeling, it's going to be a lot more robust and conclusive. But right now there's still just a lot, in my opinion, of sort of differences of opinion of how that's going to play out in the future, much like Passive House's adoption and its benefit was, say, 10, 15 years, or 10, 12 years ago.
Yeah, I agree with that. Patrick, I know you want to say something too.
I was just going to say that what we've learned in the middle market multifamily space, that it's not carbon cost, but dollar cost, that, you know, everyone runs around saying that if you build a Passive House envelope, you pay less for mechanical equipment. And that's really only true in the VRF space anyway. You know, central or individual heat pump systems, when you convert that system to a central VRF, it's a lot less equipment and a lot less cost actually than doing an individual one, we've learned. So I guess that would probably make its way into it's less raw materials, so it should make its way into less carbon.
Yeah, we were told that at the beginning of the House at Cornell Tech project, and then we started working on it. We were like, we're still putting a fan unit in every bedroom and every living room, so that's not less. And at that time, it's gotten better. This was in 2013, but at that time you couldn't get VRF evaporator units as small as we needed them once you'd sort of figured out what the load needed to be for a single bedroom to have that level of control. So I just will continue the theme of nuance, and it depends is the answer. I also wanted to reiterate, Matt, to your point, that on the question of end of life, when you do an embodied carbon study, typically you should be using the life cycle assessment, LCA methodology. Raise your hand if you know what that is. Great. It's an ISO sort of QA/QC methodology, so it's very, very clear. There's designated categories of which stages of life are being incorporated into the study. So it's really easy. It's easier to be apples to apples when you're comparing embodied carbon data from one place to another, because you know which stages of life are being incorporated. So it's just as important to be really transparent with that when you are doing studies and you are creating a target for your project, to make sure that if you are not including end of life, because that can be quite typical for some people who are studying embodied carbon, to make that very clear. Right now, for example, if you're using timber in a study, the baseline assumption is that all of that wood will just get thrown away, landfilled at the end of its useful life. And so if you're accounting for end of life and you use that baseline assumption and don't have a company like what Matt is creating, where the wood can go back into being a useful product, it kills the use of timber being beneficial. It's still better than concrete. Concrete, we've got some work to do, but it has a really, really big impact. So completely agreed on the idea of end of life.
Yeah, and I think this is something that we struggle with pretty significantly, because the end of life scenario is based on current market practice. What else could it be based on? if you have an insulation product that's not manufactured domestically, you can't theorize how recyclable it is. It's a reality. And I think that's part of, I think, what this group needs to kind of grapple with as adopters, early adopters with not only high performance, but when we're thinking about carbon, is we have to look at the future and what that means to bring these new insulation products or whatever products. CLT is another great example where it suffers kind of from a similar disadvantage. Is we need to understand the benefit of these highly recyclable materials, but we're only going to realize the data on that benefit 8 years from now, which is the cycle period of demonstration. So, but I think that's the reality. You know, Passive House was exactly the same way in the beginning. We had to demonstrate that it was, in fact, doable, cost competitive, and valuable, sustainable solution. And the same is with embodied carbon. We're just at the beginning of that technology cycle. I mean, let's be honest, we're at the complete beginning of that cycle.
Yeah, I have a few words, as you might imagine, on end of life, being guilty of throwing away more things than you can imagine at this point in my career. I have built and demolished a space that I have built in my career, and that's probably one of the most disheartening things a person could ever do. But I think that there's money to be made. Like, I look at all you guys out in the audience. If for geographies where we do see early adopters, to your point, where we do see subcontractors that are springing up, or vendors that are springing up, that are willing to take back carpet, to be able to take back gypsum wallboard. And those cycles are still not perfect. Like, I'm very disheartened to tell all of you that we do gypsum wallboard recycling in New York City and here in Boston. But when it makes its way to USA Gypsum in Pennsylvania, that still like 97% of it is going to animal bedding, and only like 3% of it is going back to gypsum wallboard to be made into new gypsum wallboard. So there are parts of that end of life cycle that are still very broken. But what we need is for more entrepreneurs to start saying, I will create a deconstruction service where you need these things demolished. Instead of sending all the laborers in there with the ads and the jackhammers, I'm going to come in, I'm going to take that thing apart, be able to salvage it, index it, inventory it, and then let other architects know, like whether it's eBay style or whatever, that these things are available for some future project. There is money to be made in that. Just letting everyone know.
It's a really good point. Right before, just specifically on that topic, I was lucky enough to have a panel chat with this woman, Catherine DeWolf, who's at ETH in Zurich, who's doing this work specifically and trying to understand and do some research around barcoding and like under the umbrella of circularity to sort of at the beginning. How do you start with materials that are inventoried so that you know where they are and you can start to plan for reusing them at the end of their life in that existing project? Matt?
Yeah, on that, I do totally agree that there's like this huge opportunity which really needs to be defined by the value of through EPD development and recyclability. An example of that is one of the existing wood fiber manufacturers in Europe, Schneiderholz. They have this great program where they send a container out to each job site. So any offcuts or extra material gets put in that container, taken back to the facility and recycled, and the contractor gets a credit for it for future purchase as a fully recyclable material. And I think the more that we identify those materials that are fully recyclable and then push the industry to make that profitable and valuable, because in the case of Schneiderholz, they have very low cost feedstock for their production, so it makes sense for them. And I think when we're talking about shifting our expectations around the materials we're using and how they can be processed at end of life, then great big doors open up and the opportunity really, I think, can be commercialized.
Cool. So far, our friends for our Passive House organization, our questions for our Passive House organization friends include, what can Passive House do on its projects about end of life for materials, in addition to measuring embodied carbon and requiring it as part of the criteria, right? And can we require EPDs for Passive House certified materials as part of their requirements to be certified, so we can actually do this work and track the information?
Yeah, and I think another kind of design challenge that comes out of it is the designing for disassembly. Thinking of how you can actually have a specialized demolition company come in, or not even a specialized demolition company come in and dismantle the building in a precise way because it's actually intended to be deconstructed. And that could be a way of helping close that loop overall. And it's an interesting design challenge, and it's something that we started thinking about when we started looking into heavy timber early on was, you know, how could this thing come apart and sort of be repurposed or reutilized in another innovative way as it reaches the end of its term, I guess you could say.
Nordic, the timber manufacturer on our project is actually going to start inventorying, giving you a disassembly instructions, basically. Here's the inventory of your building, and when it's done, take it apart and reuse it. But
Will you post that on your website as an
It's-
example for
I
everyone to learn from?
I probably won't get it, but I will if I do.
All right, cool.
But also, like, not just the end of life of the building materials, it's the leftovers that drives me nuts. It's like I have to look the other way when the project ends at just the stuff that's in the pile, and organizing it, reusing it, and recycling it is honestly a challenge.
So one thing you've learned about me so far, I'm a big raise your hand if kind of person for the audience, but it's after lunch and you guys are drowsy. So for the next one, I'm going to say if you think measuring and studying embodied carbon as part of Passive House or any building is a good idea, please stand up. Please stand up. All right. Good job. All right, cool. So if you think that in your current position of architect, engineer, builder, finance, government, etc., you think you personally have the leverage in order to make an embodied carbon target happen on a project, stay standing up. Otherwise, you can sit down. All right, cool. All right, thanks everybody. You can sit. So I think for me, this raises the question of the importance of all of us being in the room together, right? And the importance of all of us having connections, which we do, and being able to actually work on this as a team. We all have this value, right? It's a shared value. We believe in it. We want it to happen, but we do not have individual leverage. We have shared leverage. So what can we do with that, with the roles that we have today? I think we've already started to get into that a little bit with the question of circularity, design for disassembly, end of life. Like there's this real understanding of, do you need to get that? Okay. Yeah. Real understanding of like how each of this is playing out in different roles, right? Like I'm also trained as an architect, working at an engineering firm. You've had a million different lives, Matt. You've had different like everybody here is sort of like not only representing one discipline but many, which I think is also just really interesting in terms of how we all navigate the built industry and our careers. But to shift the conversation, sticking with the roles. How do you see the question of leverage playing out for you in the next couple of years on this topic? Where can you do something on your own, and where are you already starting to partner with folks to make it happen?
I'm gonna go first. So I think for me personally, it's just by doing, just proving to industry, subcontractors, employees, clients, just that by practicing sustainable measures, low carbon, low embodied carbon, and passive house design, that it's achievable without killing the budget, and hopefully over the next few months and year, we're going to prove that it's financially better for the operation of the building and for the marketability of these buildings. So just by but practicing is what I think.
Yeah, so for me, it's if we're talking about life cycle analysis, it's A4 and A5. I mean, I don't have a ton of control over 1 through 3. I can try to wedge myself into the conversations, and I will continue to do that. But for me, it is in getting toward net zero job sites. It is toward optimizing vehicle miles traveled for all of the tradespeople getting there. It is about trying to leverage more local materials and really reduce that, figuring out another way to winterize job sites that doesn't mean, heating everything with fossil fuels. So for me, it's A4 and A5.
Do you think there's a passive house version of winterization?
I think there is.
Yeah, all right.
Get finished before the winter.
Very well put. Well put. I think for us, it would be looking at practitioners like you that are kind of out in the forefront and using you as stakeholder engagement to help us develop policy and inform ways in which we can actually have a metric or standard to look toward in order to have a measured review process for embodied content in buildings. It's work that there's a lot of interest on my team that we're looking at. We had stakeholder engagements that Julie was involved with early on, investigating this practice. And to everyone's point, it is emerging, and we don't really know what that baseline is going to be or what it even looks like. And figuring out ways in which we can effectively review it and enforce it under zoning if it comes down to it. So I think ideally this happens near term, but it could be a long ways out until we actually come to resolve, because this is an emerging conversation. So.
Driven.
I mean, I like what Patrick was saying, because I think I've always seen, my role is, kind of a demonstration role to demonstrate projects are viable, that it's a better solution, from the architectural hat, right? Now that I'm involved with being a manufacturer of insulation products, it's interesting because the perspective does start to change. And I think what's the change for me is you can start to be a solution at a larger scale. When we're talking about, kind of policy on an upper level, federal policy about, what carbon means in buildings and trying to make those, develop solutions around that and using biogenic materials and so forth, we're suddenly in a different position of advocacy, which I think, as an architect, I didn't have that lever in my hand. I was asking kindly for people to produce the materials that we wanted to use, and hopefully they were cost competitive. But I think in this case, kind of changing to being a manufacturer, for me, there's suddenly a kind of a very different view on where policy can move based on providing solutions that meet those goals. But I think ultimately, this is kind of a cool panel right here, particularly with the policy side. I feel like there's so much opportunity for these incentives to be put out there, and on the side of architects and builders, it's to demonstrate the quality of these buildings that support these policies. And in a way, it's very cyclical. And then add to that kind of manufacturing new materials and new technology. So I guess for me, I'm seeing my opportunities shift a little bit based on kind of the hat I'm wearing. But I think all of them combined is really the solution. It's from every point that we can provide force.
Awesome. I'm really inspired by the work that you guys are doing. I am curious, are any of you working on a project where there is actually a requirement for an embodied carbon assessment?
So we have two projects in our portfolio, one in Dublin, Ireland, and one in New York City that are going for the ILFI zero carbon certification. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got a few of those. We've got a handful of LEED. Somerville, for those of you who don't live here, right over the river, recently started requiring LEED Platinum for labs, and LCA and embodied carbon is a really good opportunity to add some points to the checklist, which has done wonders for us. Again, Matt, to your point, in terms of really having tools in our tool belt as a design firm, as a specifier that we didn't have 2, 3, 5 years ago, right? To be able to say, there's something that you have to do now, and we can help you figure out the best way to do it. So I agree, the policy side is massive, and I'm really proud of what the city of Boston is doing on this topic. Lots of other municipalities are tackling it. So if you do have the opportunity to get engaged with policymakers to talk about Passive House, to talk about embodied carbon, please do share your expertise. A lot of folks at the municipality level really want to know, and they're looking for people like us to help them.
And I think passive, again, I'm going to go back to the corollary of Passive House is like the 10 years in advance of what embodied carbon and LCA analysis is, like the work that's been done by so many Passive House practitioners, going from being a practitioner or builder, whatever it is, to advocacy, and the scope and implementation, therefore, as a result of Passive House is absolutely mind-blowing. Like 10 years ago, I never, ever would have expected that. And I'm always looking at the glass more than half full. Like, we're making great progress. The change is so rapid in such a conservative industry. But I think Passive House is this conference is an awesome example of how education, communication, advocacy will actually significantly move the whole process forward. And I think it happens much more quickly than we think, particularly now. There's so much more conversation than there ever was.
So you're saying it's a gateway drug for energy nerds?
Whoever sells that drug out
Yeah.
there.
So I would also advocate for you reaching out to your state representatives. I mean, beyond the municipal level, all of those folks are up this year for reelection. So if they haven't knocked on your door yet, they will be knocking on your door. This is a great opportunity to bend their ear and get them in a 30-minute conversation about embodied carbon. I say this because my husband is a state representative.
Personal insight, everyone. Thank you for all of that. And I want to recognize Bronwyn's note. Yes, Passive House has the Passive House ribbon. That is a tool for assessing embodied carbon. There are lots of tools. There's OneClick, there's Tally, there's EC3. EC3 is run by Building Transparency, which is very closely related to or connected to the Carbon Leadership Forum. Throwing a lot of names out at you. But if you want to remember one, the Carbon Leadership Forum is a really excellent organization for a sort of pit stop for resources, for connections, for links, for information. There's a hub of the CLF in Boston for Boston, New England. There's a hub in New York, a hub in Seattle, a hub in LA, a hub probably where you live. So you can get involved with them. And they are the genesis of a number of programs, including SE 2050, which is an embodied carbon program for structural engineers, MEP 2040, which I'm on the steering committee of, which is a program for mechanical, electrical, plumbing, building systems engineers on the topic of embodied carbon. So if you're interested in getting involved in any of those initiatives or a hub or just looking for resources, the CLF website is an excellent place to start.
Yeah, and I would recommend signing up for their discussion digest. You can get tons of great insight just from looking at various threads. People propose a variety of questions, and it's a great information resource in general.
Can we just talk about LCA tools for 1 second? Julie brought up Tally a couple of times. And when we first started down this journey, we have folks in our organization who work in virtual design and construction, so they're in Revit models all the time. I thought, oh, this will be easy. We'll buy some license to Tally. We'll run the Revit models through Tally, and we'll see what comes out. And then there's a plug-in straight to EC3, so it'll be like building the material list for us. Those models are junk. Every one of them. Forget, like, there's not always a federated model. Sometimes we have a structural model and a core and shell model and an interiors model, but it doesn't tell me anything about like slab thickness change from one place to another, what the flooring change is, what the stud spacing is, what the wall types is. Horrible. We spent hours on the back end trying to clean up the data, especially if there wasn't one single model, making sure we weren't double counting materials. So build better models if you're going to use the tools. That's all I say.
Yeah, I'll second that to say my very first LCA was in 2013 or 2014. And for some stupid reason, I decided it was a good idea for our first LCA project to be the Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta, Georgia. Don't pick a stadium as your first one of these. Don't do it. And that project had 7 Revit models just for the concrete portion of the project. Like, it could not be federated because it was too big. And also required a huge amount of work to figure out what the F was going on and how to actually assign stuff in Tally to make it happen. So yeah, tools can be good, but models need to be way better. Yeah.
Well, there's the simple tool for the builder-friendly tool that Chris Magwood put out from, I think it's Builders for Climate Action, the BEAM tool, yeah. And that's a great resource because it's very simple. It's like almost similar to PHPP, where it's a spreadsheet. You can just kind of plug in data there, and you get a immediate feedback loop from that. And it's a simple model, so it's great for single-family housing, probably a little bit into mid-size multifamily. But it's a nice tool that just got released, and it's recognized by ILFI as a way that you can actually certify through them as well.
Yep. Sorry. The ILFI zero carbon program that Jen mentioned is a really good one to also figure out like which tools are relatively high quality because they're looking at them before they're allowing teams to use them to calculate embodied carbon for the certification program. Now I feel like I would be remiss if I don't mention all of the tools that I know about from all of our friends. So here we go. Payette Architects has developed a tool called Kaleidoscope. It's specifically looking at facade assembly systems and helping to assess embodied carbon, which is great because insulation is one of the key topics that we look at in this thread. SE 2050 has a tool on their website looking at structure, again, timber, concrete, steel, big material decisions with big impacts. The MEP 2040 website will shortly have a tool posted on it by Buro Happold, specifically about refrigerants to be able to show the impact of that, which is massive. Next gen refrigerants PS are available in the market today, and every project should be using them. What am I forgetting? Thank you. Thornton Tomasetti's Beacon is also another tool that's out there. There are so many tools. Please don't create another one. If you're thinking about it, please just like find a friend and make one that exists better. There's also one called CARE, which has also just been posted to the CLF website, and that one is specifically about new construction versus existing buildings to be able to provide a high level sort of what type of building is your existing building, when was it built, how leaky is it, like good, bad, terrible, right? So it's a relatively high level, but it helps a lot in the kinds of conversations that we might be able to have at the beginning of projects where there is an existing building being considered. Our friend Greg Hale from NYSERDA can shout out the name of a really good resource for existing buildings if he's so inclined.
One more just to shout out for the A4, A5. Green Badger is an online tool that we're using, and we've made an investment in trying to find a friend and make something better, that is helping us track that embodied carbon for the construction process side. And they're also going to delve into social. So when we're looking at our diversity spend on projects, what percentage of dollars are going to underutilized or minority businesses, we're going to be able to track that through that tool as well.
Thank you. There's also one on landscape, but I don't remember the name. Bronwyn.
Start to add PV and storage into your calculations when you're calculating net zero goals.
Yep.
Huge and scary, and it makes Passive House look like a rock star.
Agreed. Yeah. Hopefully the energy storage conversation can stay mostly at the grid scale and we don't overdo it at the building scale, but I think the pace of the market is going to help us determine how all of that looks. All right, so time to share dirty laundry, if you have any. Missteps, lessons learned, things you wish you would have done differently on some of the projects that you've worked on, things you hope to avoid if you haven't worked on too many. You don't have to name names.
I mean, I think I'll start out. I mean, I think the thing that that I didn't appreciate when I first learned about what embodied carbon was how little detail is actually available. Like how much of the building we still just do not know about, and I think that, you know, I mean, there's a lot of work being done in order to push on, you know, different manufacturers in order to get that data. But I think that was a big misperception of mine in the very beginning, is what was the story we will actually be able to tell at the end of the day.
I would just say, just don't rush into it. I think the cowboy approach works to a degree, but if you take a more measured response, especially entering this very complicated world of embodied carbon, to really take a serious look at what you're doing, how you can have a good measured approach and have a good resolution.
And in that same vein, I think just, you know, try to adapt and evolve as best you can, but don't beat yourself up about not getting it perfect, because it's step by step.
Yeah, there's so many missteps to discuss. The one that I'm going to talk about, though, which I think is important for all of us in the room to think about, though, from my own experience, is the lesson learned is that in some cases, the solutions are not going to come from the outside. in some case, but I like the idea of find a partner and be strategic about how you identify a problem and move it forward. But the lesson that we learned is, we were waiting and waiting for solutions to our problems, and they just weren't forthcoming. We were looking at the big industry players, and they're not going to take those risks. I think we've talked to all of them. They are not going to take those risks. And so it's like unlikely architect and chemist, which is what Timber HP is, decided to take this massive risk. And I think for the group as innovators in Passive House, I just want to say that we have to look beyond and take the risk. We've been doing that for years, and we have to continue to do that. And we have refined Passive House in the United States, made it its own thing, which was so important to kind of have clarity about US construction systems and requirements and delivery. And the same is true with carbon and materials and mechanical systems. I mean, I'm not going to get into any of those businesses myself, but there is so much innovation that's required. We're not there by any stretch of the imagination. So what I'm going to say is my lesson learned is let's just do this. Let's make sure innovation happens, and let's take those risks because we have no choice.
Cool. I think a few things I learned getting into it was that what I thought was going to move the needle didn't. So the idea, because it's so new, Matt, to your point, I think that there are starting to be some rules of thumb that emerge, right? Like we know the really bad insulation stuff is really bad. And we know that timber is better than concrete, but concrete can also be good, and steel can be very good, and timber, if it's thrown away at the end of the project, is not great. So there's a lot of nuance involved in all of these studies, and I would say go into it with no assumptions, and try not to make assumptions before you actually do the study. So for the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, we used ETFE instead of glass for the facade, and I thought, awesome, we're going to save so much weight, the structure is going to be so much smaller, this is a really big deal, this is going to be one of our key variables and one of our key winners in our model. And it was that, right? It barely moved the needle because there was so much concrete on the project, and if we didn't address the concrete, there was no way we were going to get to our goal. So the analogy is pretty similar to energy modeling. Know where your energy is going. The first question is, where is all of the embodied carbon, so that we can target where the biggest buckets are first. So I think that was one of the key lessons learned for me. I also had no idea how big of an impact refrigerants make. I didn't realize how much they leak all the time. It's pretty bad, you guys. So to the extent that we can really only use next gen refrigerants that have a global warming potential of 1 or near to 0, we're doing ourselves a massive favor on that side. Those are the two things that come to mind for me. Anybody else have something they absolutely need to share so nobody else makes the mistake? Keep it local. Very good idea. If you think of something, just shout it out whenever, and we'll remember that that's what you're talking about. All right, so we've got 20 minutes. You guys are really hanging in there. Thank you. Shifting the narrative to maximize opportunity with a key question: how does an embodied carbon imperative create new opportunity for the built environment? I think we have talked about this, right? Matt is evidence of creating new opportunity and risk. Opportunity comes with risk usually, right? What are some other ways that you're seeing embodied carbon open a door for a different conversation, for a new product, for a new client, for something new as an opportunity?
I mean, I'm going to double down on it again. I think that there's so much education that still needs to happen, especially at the client owner level around embodied carbon. They have an understanding of what it is to a certain degree. But when we show them that other side of the coin, because they don't think it has anything to do with us as a general contractor, right? When we show them the other side, and we show them the data that we found from our job sites and how they're impacted by the fossil fuel usage, by all those things. I had a client ask me yesterday about big earth moving equipment that is electric. And I don't, like, it doesn't exist yet. Like, you can, Volvo, you can reserve a piece of equipment. Who knows when you'll actually get it? They're starting to come online, but there's got to be a lot of R&D research that goes on back there. And I think that you just keep daylighting these topics for clients. They are all aware that they have net zero goals corporately, and they are all aware that they functionally have no idea how they're going to get there. And they are also not thinking about embodied carbon generally when they're doing that. They're thinking primarily about operational carbon. So you just unpack a whole new set of problems for them almost in the conversation, but come with solutions, right? Say, you're not accounting for this currently. It is still part of your carbon problem. Let me tell you how we can solve it. And that's the big win that we come out of conversations with clients.
So drive with awareness, basically.
I think, I'm going to talk more about feedstock and material resources. And I think one of the interesting things, again, I'm just speaking from experience here on what's happened recently, is we're looking for sustainable solutions. We're looking for changing basically the materials that we're using to build buildings. And as I said before, we're advocating for biogenic recyclable materials, carbon storing, and so forth. And I think what's interesting in the US is we've gone through this cycle in the past 15 years, which has to do with where we manufacture products. And that's, as we all know, has by and large gone offshore. And what's interesting about that is I think there's this connection that needs to be made between the natural resources that we have that are renewable and recyclable when harvested sustainably, and it's not just timber, the opportunity for value-add processing to waste stream materials, and the reutilization of industrial manufacturing spaces and systems and people with that know-how. And I think that was the lesson for us, is we wanted to find a solution to insulate our buildings that was scalable and cost competitive. It led us to this journey, which had to do with understanding the entire forest products industry in the United States, specifically in Maine, the decline of the paper industry and what that meant for local communities and economies and supply chain, and the underutilization of manufacturing ability, know-how, and systems. And I feel like the bigger opportunity about all of this is we can't just look at the isolated solution as the benefit, but when we start to look at the material sourcing, the communities where that's coming from, and to ensure that it's sustainable, to ensure that it's appropriate, in the case of timber, sustainably harvested, which is an important criteria, particularly on the LCA side, that weighs in very heavily on the EPD. But I feel like the opportunity is for us all to cast a wider kind of net, or look more broadly at the horizon about all the layers of benefit that can happen with changing the industry. And wood is vastly underutilized resource, even while sustainably harvested. The regeneration rate in Maine is 30% above harvesting currently. That had to do with the massive decline of the paper industry. We bought an old paper mill. It used to make the New York Times, which is why cellulose feedstock is limited, because we're not reading papers the same way. But the entire supply chain is very similar, and the value and the benefit of creating rural jobs and rural employment and backfilling the incredible devastation that removing manufacturing from the economy of the United States in so many of these rural communities has had. And so for me, there's like, we have these opportunities, and I think we as a group, because we specify and source so many materials in building trades at large scale, have this real opportunity to start to push new opportunities, and that can be jobs, that can be local, and that can be sustainable. And I feel like the impacts of making these decisions and asking these questions can go far beyond, was it cellulose or fiberglass? I mean, innovation can drive massive change that has all these benefits. I think that's the case.
Travis, I'm curious on the city side, policy-wise, does anything stand out to you relative to opportunity and the growth of the embodied carbon conversation?
Yeah, actually, as I was sitting here, I was just thinking of workforce development and training initiatives, and thinking about green jobs and creating a green economy locally, and how important that can be. And having practitioners move over to manufacturing, having more localized manufacturing streams, creating jobs, creating resources. Thinking of, we're actually on a planned new market study right now, looking at that as a kind of a 21st century industrial corridor. And what does that mean? What does that mean for light manufacturing, bringing jobs back into the city, and actually harnessing around this emerging industry? You think about Europe, every little town has its own little window manufacturer in it, right? You can get triple glazed window from the shop down the street. What does that look like when that starts happening in the urban sector or within our region? And thinking about just job training and opportunity for a lot of people.
Very cool. Matt, while you were talking about the idea of the sort of many layered, right, way of looking at it and the whole supply chain, I started thinking about the question of environmental justice and social equity and the impact that these decisions also have on the most vulnerable communities that have typically been located next to fossil fuel burning power plants, fossil fuel burning industrial plants, and the idea that as we're tracking embodied carbon and pushing the market to materials that have a lower embodied carbon footprint, that means that the footprint is not just a feather in our cap for a low carbon project, but it's a real physical improvement of the quality of life for the people who are impacted by those physical manufacturing plants and power plants. I wonder, has anybody here done any work on the question of health, well-being, social equity, et cetera, relative to carbon?
I would say a little indirectly. So we're actually engaging in a study to look at grid reliability and resilience, and developing health and wellness metrics that are have an informed resilience response as the grid gets more electricity in its capacity, and what would happen during a load shed event, and where would people go, and what services need to stay intact. And we can use that from a city planning perspective of, okay, we need to locate a resilient node in this neighborhood. We need to start thinking about shelter in place. The shelter in place gets back to the retrofit, so it's the duration of time in which that house can kind of sit and without electricity, without any power, but actually still maintain a level of comfort. So that could help inform what it looks like when you do a deep energy retrofit, and kind of thinking about kind of these overall kind of comfort benefits, health and wellness benefits, and keeping those things intact overall is something that we're starting to investigate and develop a framework for.
So, I would just sort of acknowledge that these conversations around the social equity piece are really starting to come to the forefront on a lot of our projects. We do some work in Columbia University, and they have for a long time had what they call the clean construction program, right? So they will not allow equipment on their job site that doesn't meet certain EPA rules. There are noise and vibration and business disruption metrics that we have to adhere to on a daily basis, because they know that the community that they operate in is an environmental justice community. And we have sort of learn those lessons and are trying to pull them into other places. We've got another project that we're doing in Utah where we're literally putting a hospital in the backyard of a neighborhood, right? So like imagine if your backyard fence led to a hospital. And so acknowledging the impact that that's going to have during the construction process for the community in which we're operating. The owner of that hospital also recognizes the climate impacts, and so they're trying to build an all-electric hospital. I think, and then they've also got mandates. You talk about the underutilized business piece, that we have to utilize a certain amount of locally owned businesses, right? In order to help creep up that local economy. So super early stages, still a lot of pre-con to go. But
Do they already have a design team?
Unfortunately, yes. but you're always top of mind. So, but those are the kind of conversations that we see happening more and more frequently, and that it's giving our buildings purpose. It's giving our jobs purpose. Like I feel like even with the employees from our side who are on that job feel a greater sense of purpose when those are the goals that are assigned to a project.
Did anybody see the video Greening Southie? Is that the name of it?
I still have that DVD.
I still have the DVD too. Did anybody see it? Okay, I've got one nodding head up here. It's phenomenal, and it's old at this point. It's you're gonna watch it and be like, well, they're not really doing anything that's that remarkable these days, right? Because it was pretty early in the LEED movement. It's a LEED certified project in South Boston, and it was a documentary. Is that fair to say? Of a construction team that built this building and how they felt about it. And the big win was that somebody took the time to actually engage everybody building the building to help them understand what the goals were, why it was important, what the consequences are, what the opportunities are, and the amount of pride that everyone engaged on that project had was like, I'm getting goosebumps right now thinking about it. It was really amazing. So I think that like the one of the key opportunities that I see relative to embodied carbon is that it's one more layer of opportunity for us to not only have ourselves, but to share with everyone around us who's engaged in all of our projects, to be able to help illustrate and talk about what all of the benefits are and all of the things that we can be proud of that we're doing in the built environment.
Yeah, there's one scene, just to talk about insulation for a moment. There's one scene in there where the gentleman who was responsible for insulating the project talks about how the new insulation didn't leave him with that itchy, scratchy feeling, and that he didn't have to, I think he describes it, he didn't have to change his clothes before he went home and hugged his kids, right? So for him, that was like the eureka moment. Like, why don't we build all the buildings this way?
On the topic of light manufacturing and the sort of what's the urban industrial corridor, there's also a huge amount of development happening in all of our cities around the U.S. Everybody wants to have an innovation district, right? And one of the Kendall Square is like the innovation district. The Somerville has this block of buildings called Summer Nova, and they call themselves a small innovation district. One of the things that they have there is this place called Greentown Labs. It is a sort of co-op tenant, like bunch of tenants in an old warehouse building, all green tech. And not just tech, not just PV, not just renewable energy, but like somebody talking about electric scooters and somebody talking about zero carbon concrete. And I think that the idea of job creation and being able to help the folks who have been in industrial roles stay in industrial roles if they want to, by virtue of shifting over to the green economy, it's not just PV. Right? Like there's a huge amount of opportunity when it comes to what counts as green tech, and being able to support that, again, through the question of embodied carbon and therefore the materials that we're selecting on projects, it's going to help shift the market. And if we can shift the market, we can shift how people are doing things. Or you can start your own company like Matt did.
There's also the Greentown Labs Houston, which focuses heavily on geothermal, which is interesting because of all the drilling that occurs and how that drilling technology can transfer over to deep well geothermal technology. So that's another example of shifting the sector.
Super. All right, so we're at the last 5 minutes. We're going to end a couple minutes early unless we have lots of things to say as a closing round. But thank you for being here. Thank you for having us. Embodied carbon is super, super important. There's so many resources out there right now. It can feel a little overwhelming. So like Travis said, it's not necessary to be a cowboy. Find a friend to help yourself out if you need it. And otherwise, I will ask for closing comments, any final words of wisdom that you would like to leave with everyone.
I would just say that when you were asking questions earlier, that most, if not all, people knew what embodied carbon was, but very few hands were raised when you asked if they were tracking it on a project. And I would just say, just pick a project and start doing it, because that's the only way you learn.
Do your LCA lead points so we don't have to ask you to maybe do your LCA lead points during review, and then buy Matt's insulation.
I think my thought is that Passive House has laid the way in terms of this disciplined approach to evaluating data around how buildings perform. And we're talking about operational carbon for Passive House, and we're talking about embodied carbon on LCA modeling. The data is in development on LCA, I'd say more than Passive House. I feel Passive House data is extremely robust at this point, but it's the same adoption cycle. It's the same idea of technology pushing the market. And I feel like this group here is the group, based on your track record, who will actually make the difference, who will be those early adopters who take that same discipline and will have that same leveraged effect in the marketplace. Because I think we all have to agree that Passive House has had a massive leveraging effect in the marketplace.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think to Jennifer's point, just share and spread awareness with the team, your teams and your owners and so forth. I mean, we're all here in this room because we care about this, but there's a whole city being built of people that aren't aware and don't really care at this point. So just pay it forward and push people to understand. I mean, I sort of learned from Passive House consultants as I got into that movement, and gained awareness that way. So I was like, just, yeah, share.
Well, I'll build off of Jen's point in terms of like, pick a project and start figuring it out. Also start including an EPD requirement in your specifications for your projects.
I do have actually one final thing. Again, just from the contractor's perspective, there is, so you mentioned SC 2050, you mentioned AIA 2030. I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention an MEP 2040, so staggered goals there. But I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that there is something for contractors. It is called the Contractor's Commitment. And it does deal with carbon, job site, wellness, materials, to the point that we have leverage for them, waste, and water. And so each of those 5 categories has like a good, better, best tier. You can write that into your specifications. You can start putting that in your RFPs, asking contractors if they're part of the contractor's commitment or if they're signatory to the contractor's commitment, and then helping move those contractors along in terms of getting them where they need to be on the carbon journey.
Thank you. There's also an organization called Owners Can. It like really the list just keeps going on and on and on. But please do go to the CLF website. I think they have all of those there as links. Otherwise, feel free to grab us at some point if we mention something and you don't know where to find it. Thank you.